Before Spider-Man came into the MCU, and before Insomniac took over the Spider-Man game franchise, Activision and the developer of Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, Beenox, built two open-world Spider-Man games centered around the pair of Amazing Spider-Man films from director Mark Webb. Find out about both of them in Amazing Spider-Man Game Duology. Game Facts Special: the start of a new era. When Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4 got its plug pulled in January 2010, work immediately began on a reboot of the Spider-Man film franchise. After a year of development, a new film in a new universe was announced in February 2011, and the video game accompaniment was announced at the 2011 New York Comic-Con in October, just 8 months later. Unfortunately, that announcement wasn't backed up with any kind of gameplay footage or even images of the game in action. It was more like a statement of intent, but there were a few particularly interesting pieces of information included in that announcement. Game developer Beenox would be building the game from the ground up. It would also take place after the events of the film. The fact that the Amazing Spider-Man video game would itself act as a kind of sequel to the movie it tied into seemed adventurous even at the time. But having Beenox as the developer was something that was a mixed bag in terms of sentiment. You see, after the average reviews of Shaba Games' Spider-Man Web of Shadows, Beenox took over development duties on Spider-Man games for Activision. Beenox and Activision had collaborated previously on ports of Ultimate Spider-Man and Spider-Man Friend or Foe, but now they were being given a budget to create their own Spider-Man game, and boy was it a doozy. The first Spider-Man game was a game so good and so inspired that it is directly responsible for a comic run that was used as a basis for probably the best Spider-Man movie ever made, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. That's right, the multiversal adventures of 2014's Spider-Verse comics and 2018's Into the Spider-Verse and its upcoming sequel can be traced back to Beenox's work on Shattered Dimensions. Unfortunately, they also made Spider-Man Edge of Time, which was not nearly as beloved or well-reviewed. Activision wanted another game immediately after Shattered Dimensions, which meant Edge of Time had a short development timeline, and we all know what happens when things are rushed. To make matters worse, Edge of Time was released around the same time the Amazing Spider-Man video game was announced. So, Spider-Man fans weren't sure what to think about Beenox working on a potentially huge Spider-Man project. Thankfully, the Canadian development studio was more than open to feedback. Developing the Amazing Spider-Man. Doug Heder, a producer at Activision in charge of Beenox's Spider-Man games, openly recognized Beenox's mixed track record. However, he promised that the upcoming film tie-in would not suffer the same fate as Edge of Time due to its increased development time. According to Beenox's creative director, Gerard Lahayani, they took the Amazing Spider-Man project very seriously. When Beenox was assigned to start working on The Amazing Spider-Man, they split their workforce into two teams, one that was finishing up Edge of Time, and one that would start building The Amazing Spider-Man. So, when the game was announced, but not shown, it had allegedly been in development for about a year already, which meant they had another 8 months until it would launch. That was more development time than they had for their previous two games, and meant that they had plenty of time to plan out what they wanted to do, and implement the feedback they were getting from Edge of Time reviews. It would seem they used their time wisely, because the Amazing Spider-Man game was not just incredibly different from their previous projects, but it also took a lot of interesting creative risks. Unlike Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time, The Amazing Spider-Man returned to the open-world free-roam map of Manhattan that the previous Spider-Man film tie-ins made standard. In more than one interview, Beenox studio head Dee Brown stated that he wanted to give Spider-Man the game he deserves. And it seems like he tried his best, because Beenox threw everything and the kitchen sink into this game. Since the film their game was on was going to be a complete reboot, that gave the Beenox team the inspiration they needed to make something special. The Amazing Spider-Man has stealth gameplay and rhythmic combat, heavily inspired by Rocksteady's Batman Arkham games, complete with a dedicated dodge button and flashy finishing moves. Of course, players were also encouraged to use the new web shooters, which could be upgraded with experience points. One interesting graphical touch the team included was that as Spider-Man suffered damage in battle, his suit would tear and deteriorate just as it does in the movie. To get around the open world, Beenox worked hard on what they called Web Rush. This system allowed players to pick a point in the distance, press a button, and Spider-Man would automatically travel to that point as quickly and stylishly as possible, with different animations being used depending on what needed to be traversed to get to that point. Running on walls, swinging on flagpoles, and web zipping made for a traversal system that was as cool looking as it was efficient. This was allegedly one of the most difficult parts of the game to get working, since Beenox knew it needed to work just as well within the indoor missions as it did in the overworld, which required very different calculations and animations. Instead of the standard third-person camera, this Spider-Man game used a much closer, over-the-shoulder perspective similar to Resident Evil 4. This greatly increased the sense of immersion and the illusion of speed in the game, and remains as something that makes The Amazing Spider-Man unique, even among more recent Spider-Man games. Beenox also convinced Marvel to allow them to include full issues of comics within the game as unlockables, including the very first appearance of Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy number 15. Additionally, their decision to place the game's story after the events of the movie allowed them to create a story that wasn't bound by the movie's script. This resulted in the inclusion of reinvented villains like Rhino, who instead of being just a dude in a suit, was now a half-rhino, half-human hybrid out for revenge on his creators. Very, very cool. On top of all that, the overworld would evolve and offer different random crime missions as you progress through the story. They brought back Bruce Campbell to cameo and homage to the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie games, and, maybe most importantly, you could play as Stan Lee in a mission that saw him reclaiming lost pages of a comic he was working on. But instead of walking around, he has the same web-swinging and wall-crawling powers as Spider-Man. As you can see, the Amazing Spider-Man game had quite a lot going for it. Unfortunately, the game was met with the same average reviews as Edge of Time, with only the PS3 version breaking past a 70 Metacritic score after it was launched, alongside versions for the Nintendo Wii, 3DS, DS, and Xbox 360 on June 26, 2012. Not quite the reception Beenox was hoping for, especially considering all the effort they put into it. But they would get a second chance shortly after The Amazing Spider-Man launched. Second Chances, The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Following in the footsteps of its predecessor, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was announced at the 2013 New York Comic-Con, and given a release date for spring of the following year. In addition to targeting the same consoles as the last go-round, it would also launch on the brand new PS4 and the Xbox One a little later on. With the promise of new hardware to fuel their creative flow, Beenox dove back into the world of The Amazing Spider-Man again, for the last time. Beenox was made aware of the issues with The Amazing Spider-Man, and took everything into account when making the sequel. They rebuilt the open world from the ground up, utilizing more interesting architecture and creating more diverse neighborhoods in order to, according to executive producer Stefan Gravel, create a more fun and interesting playground to web-swing around. Although the inclusion of the subway fast travel system meant that you didn't have to swing around if you didn't want to. Speaking of web swinging, that system was also completely overhauled. Instead of using a single trigger to throw web lines to invisible anchor points, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 made use of both triggers for swinging. Each trigger corresponds to an arm, and proper web swinging involved practiced timing of trigger pulls and jumps to gain speed and maneuver. This change made getting around more immersive and interactive. Web Rush mode, a fan favorite from The Amazing Spider-Man, also made its return. Its use in combat was also expanded, allowing for precision dodges and critical strikes. The Hero or Menace morality system was a new inclusion Beenox developed for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but was one that was unfortunately not very well received. In order to maintain hero status, players would have to respond to the infinite, repetitive random crimes that occurred throughout the city, another returning feature from the previous game. If they failed to respond in time or completely ignored too many of those side activities, their reputation would decrease into menace status, and strike teams would spawn in around the city to attack Spider-Man. This system was so poorly received that Beenox's co-head Thomas Wilson actually apologized for it years later in an interview with Games Radar. Hanging up the suit. For all of the improvements and new mechanics that were attempted for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, the game was ultimately seen as a step down from the previous title. It was critically panned, with none of the many versions of the game scoring higher than a 58 Metacritic score. Critics cited a lack of polish, dull combat, and overall poor execution in just about every review. Just like Edge of Time, it would seem The Amazing Spider-Man 2's shortened development time caused its demise. Despite their passion for the license, Beenox just wasn't able to put together the stellar Spider-Man game they wanted to make. And unfortunately, they never got another chance. The third Amazing Spider-Man film never materialized. Beenox moved on to working on Skylanders and Call of Duty games, and Insomniac developed the next Spider-Man game for Sony, which we will talk about real soon. From its conception to its development and release, there is a ton to learn about Insomniac Games' magnum opus, Marvel's Spider-Man. How did Insomniac get involved with Spider-Man? Who are the people behind the game's development? How did they design such an iconic Spider-Man suit? What other games did the team draw inspiration from? Find out all of these answers and more in Making of Marvel's Spider-Man Game Facts Special. The Fallen Hero. It's no secret that everyone's friendly neighborhood Spider-Man has a history of so-so video game adaptations. We even have a few videos outlining those games, which you should also check out. The slate of Spider-Man video games was, let's say, worse for wear at the tail end of 2014. Activision had been handling the IP since 2000, which resulted in a few good titles. They kicked things off pretty strongly at the beginning with the Spider-Man PlayStation 1 game by Neversoft, a few Game Boy Color games, and then the tie-in games to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy. The latter of which even gave rise to what many consider to be the game that revolutionized Spider-Man games forever, Spider-Man 2. After that point though, Spider-Man games were hit or miss for several years. Then, the franchise seemed to hit a high once more with Beenox's Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions in September 2010. Activision wanted to immediately capitalize on that game's success, but unfortunately, impossible development timelines led to rushed games that soured the Spider-Man experience. Spider-Man Edge of Time and the two Amazing Spider-Man tie-in games that came between 2011 and 2014 appeared to have put the IP on ice for several years. But behind the scenes, things were brewing. Spider-Man was, and still is, the most popular superhero on the planet. So, why were the video games based on him turning out so poorly? Spider-Man fans wanted to get their hero back on track, to play a game that made them feel like their favorite superhero again. Little did they know at the time that the next great web-slinging adventure was just a few years away. A powerful partnership. In the midst of the less-than-stellar Spider-Man games being released, the winds of change began to blow at Marvel Games. Their output throughout the 2000s and into the 2010s mostly consisted of film tie-ins, which tended to suffer from the same problem that plagued the Amazing Spider-Man games, rushed developments. These didn't always turn out badly, just take a look at X-Men Origins Wolverine. However, most of them were either forgettable or just not very fun. Remember the Thor game for the PS3? What about the Ghost Rider game from 2007? Yeah, I didn't think so. The relatively low quality of Marvel games up to that point led to their output relying on Marvel vs. Capcom and LEGO Marvel games on consoles, and a smattering of throwaway, microtransaction-filled mobile games by the mid-2010s. The era of the Marvel film tie-in game curiously ended in 2014 with the release of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a game that many regard as even worse than the first game, despite the best efforts of developer Beenox. It's probably no coincidence that this is also the same year that Jae Ong joined Marvel Games as executive vice president, with the goal of creating a strategy that would, quote, usher in a brand new era for the Marvel Games business. In order to overhaul how they planned and created superhero games, Marvel turned to Sony. The relationship between the two companies had been kept strictly in the filmmaking business up to that point, having been partners since Sony-owned Columbia Pictures purchased the rights to make Spider-Man films 15 years prior. However, when it comes to making awesome video game experiences, Sony is also one of the best in the business, thanks to their PlayStation division. This is exactly what Marvel was looking for when it began meeting with the company. The exact details of these secretive meetings have been kept locked up somewhere even Rhino couldn't break into, but this much is clear. Marvel was in talks with Sony for some time, and they wanted to leverage the connections that PlayStation had made from nearly 20 years in the video game industry. One of those connections is somehow simultaneously a titan and an underdog in the world of interactive entertainment: Insomniac Games. The underdog. Since 1998, Insomniac has been responsible for creating some of the most iconic PlayStation experiences, having developed Spyro the Dragon, Ratchet & Clank, and the Resistance series. For 16 years, Insomniac's entire body of work had been developed for PlayStation hardware, save for Fuse, but the less that's said about that, the better. Despite creating some of the highest-selling PlayStation titles, Insomniac still wasn't locked in as a first-party developer by this time. Funny enough, the first project they ever developed exclusively for a competitor's hardware would lead to Sony finally making the commitment and bringing the Superstar studio in-house. The talks between Marvel and Sony are believed to have picked up steam, or at least gained direction, in October 2014. Insomniac had finally flexed its freedom as a second-party developer by releasing the Xbox-exclusive game Sunset Overdrive, which was receiving the excellent reviews typical of a release from Insomniac Games. At some point after that game's release, the Insomniac offices were visited by a friendly, familiar face: Connie Booth. Connie is currently the Senior Vice President and Head of Internal Production at PlayStation, but she's been with the company for 25 years, serving first as an executive producer and then climbing the ranks of product development. In her time at PlayStation, she's worked with Naughty Dog, Sucker Punch, and Insomniac, among others, to help them get their games to market. So, by that point in 2014, Connie and Insomniac had a very strong relationship. Having been a part of the conversations between Sony and Marvel, Connie was also the person who brought up Insomniac as a potential development partner for Sony and Marvel, which was the reason for her visit on that day in October 2014. The irresistible offer. When Connie stepped into the Burbank, California headquarters of Insomniac Games, she met with the studio's founder and head honcho, Ted Price. This was the point at which Connie presented Ted with an irresistible offer. What would you think about working on a Marvel game? You'd think that a question like that might cause the leader of any video game studio to do somersaults and maybe even some Spider-Man-like acrobatics, but not Ted Price. His initial reaction to the question was something that basically equated to meh. According to Price himself, his first reaction was fairly neutral due to Insomniac's lack of experience with licensed material. From the very beginning, Insomniac Games has been creating completely original characters and stories born from their own imaginations, and working with someone else's creations wasn't even something that had crossed his mind. Ted doubted if his team would even want to try to tackle something that was as established as a Marvel character. He didn't say no exactly, but he did let Connie know he would consult the team to see what they thought about the proposal. Insomniac culture being such that Ted Price and his managers always gauge the level of team interest before deciding upon projects. When Ted spoke to some members of the team, he realized his assumption of a tepid response was way off the mark. Insomniac's own Brian Intihar caught wind of the news and demanded Insomniac take the deal and he be made creative director of the project, proclaiming he, quote, would give up one of my arms to work on a Marvel game. A company announcement soon followed and was met with gasps of anticipation around the office. There was no indecision or contemplation of working with an established IP, especially a Marvel IP. According to Ted, the response was more like, "Are you crazy? Of course we're going to work on a Marvel game." In short order, Ted got in contact with Connie to relay Insomniac's enthusiasm for the proposition, and then the studio took a seat at the table to become the third player in the Marvel-Sony talks. The wondrous webhead. At first, there was no solid plan for what Insomniac would be taking on in this new partnership. However, it was clear from the beginning that Marvel really wanted whatever Insomniac's interpretation was of a Marvel character. In fact, that was the core requirement for the entire project. Wanting to avoid the mistakes they made for many years, the only condition Marvel had was that whatever they made had to be completely original and not tied to a movie or comic. They even gave Insomniac free rein in choosing a character from the entire roster of Marvel heroes to make a game and an original story around. As mentioned, Insomniac specializes in creating original stories and worlds. So, this requirement was definitely a non-issue and was probably even instrumental in having them take on the project. According to Ted Price, the Insomniac team talked about quite a few superheroes they wanted to tackle, but Spider-Man rose to the top pretty quickly. Aside from his role as the most popular superhero in the world, the Insomniac team felt like they identified with Spider-Man. He's a regular guy, imbued with incredible purpose and power. Spider-Man has to juggle impossible dangers associated with protecting an entire city with leading a normal life and protecting the ones he loves. In many people's eyes, Spider-Man is a character they can identify with. A character forced to overcome impossible odds, and doing so with a sense of humor. An underdog, just like Insomniac. The dynamic between heroism and humanism that Spider-Man embodies as a character was particularly interesting for Insomniac's writers, who were chomping at the bit to create an original story for a character they grew up loving. In fact, just about everyone on the team grew up loving Spider-Man, and you can feel that love and passion for his story in every frame of the finished product. With everyone in agreement, and Marvel more than happy to allow them to create something new and special for a character that's been so well known for decades, Marvel's Spider-Man began development and became Insomniac Games' first licensed video game in its entire 22 years of existence. Great responsibility. It would take all of Insomniac's power to carry the great responsibility of this enormous project. When everything was said and done, hundreds of people worked on Marvel's Spider-Man to get it into gamers' hands. However, the people leading the development charge were the creative directors. Brian Horton, who had been at Insomniac since 2018 and whose previous credits include work on the rebooted Tomb Raider series at Crystal Dynamics and Crash Mind Over Mutant. Marcus Smith, an Insomniac veteran since the PS2 era, working on everything from Ratchet to Resistance. And Brian Intihar, who started at Insomniac more than 15 years ago as a community manager and has worked his way up to creative director. The director of gameplay, Doug Sheehan, was heavily involved in creating Spider-Man's momentum-based swinging for the game. Art director Jacinda Chu more recently served as art director on Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart and is responsible for the new iconic suit in Marvel's Spider-Man. Along with Jacinda, Spider-Man's lead designer, Cameron Christian, went on to co-direct Spider-Man Miles Morales and previously worked on Lord of the Rings Conquest and the original Star Wars Battlefront 2 at Pandemic Studios. Lead director Brian Weiser worked with a team of 12 animators, crafting early attack animations and cinematics for the game. Game director Ryan Smith has such credits to his name as Sunset Overdrive and Ratchet & Clank PS4. Head writer John Paquette had previously written several games for Insomniac, including Sunset Overdrive. Finally, the soundtrack was put together by John Paisano, who also worked on the soundtrack for Netflix's Daredevil and Defender series. With leadership in place, Insomniac set about deciding what their Spider-Man game could and would be. Rebuilding an icon. Once the reality of what they had to do began to set in, some members of the team at Insomniac began to feel the weight of the greatness associated with the hero they chose to bring to life. The game's director, Ryan Smith, said, "It's pretty daunting if you think about it, trying to make a great Spider-Man game and really do it justice." Art director Jacinda Chu felt a similar fear of wanting to do justice for such a beloved character. Spider-Man had been around for over 50 years at that point, so where do you even begin to tackle something that already has hundreds of different interpretations and variations? But when they got down to it, the team at Insomniac attacked the development of Marvel's Spider-Man with the same fervor and dedication that they had for any of their other projects. Creative director Brian Intihar's challenge in that role was to create something that strikes a balance between a character that stays true to the spirit of Spider-Man and one that occupies in its own continuity as an original version of the character in order to still have the ability to surprise longtime fans. To rebuild Spider-Man from the ground up, Intihar worked with the Insomniac writing team led by head writer John Paquette, while Jacinda Chu worked on the visual representation of their new Spider-Man. Who is Spider-Man?
All units, level 4 mobilization. Location, Fisk Tower.
Fisk? The narrative and structure of Marvel's Spider-Man weren't handled by just anybody. Counted among the ranks of the writers involved with the project were Kelsey Beachum, Christos Gage, and Dan Slott. If these names don't seem particularly familiar to you, you've still probably seen something they've been involved with. Kelsey Beachum, for instance, is responsible for the winding, twisting, overlapping sci-fi narrative of Outer Wilds, while Christos Gage has written for TV shows including Netflix's Daredevil, Law & Order SVU, and Hawaii Five-0. Gage was also already intimately familiar with Spider-Man, having written for The Superior Spider-Man, Spider-Geddon, and the X-Men and Spider-Man team-up title, among other Marvel comics. Dan Slott is another comic writer known for his work on The Amazing Spider-Man, She-Hulk, and Silver Surfer. Each of these writers brought their knowledge and love for the character, as well as their own skills and methods to contribute to the story of Marvel's Spider-Man. However, it was their combined efforts that gave us this world, and the process of creating it was no easy task. First, they needed to figure out who their Spider-Man was. Yes, he's Peter Parker, but who is Peter in this new universe? What relationships has he lost or maintained over the years? How old is he? The question of age was something that was settled fairly quickly. When outlining the new character, the creative team decided that their Peter Parker would be older, wiser, and more skilled than the often teenage versions of the character that have been portrayed in various media. Instead of a 16 or 17-year-old high schooler, Insomniac's Peter Parker would be a 23-year-old who has learned a lot about love, life, and work by the time we meet him. He has a failed, strained relationship with Mary Jane, he's left the Daily Bugle to become a researcher working alongside Otto Octavius, and he frequently meets up with Aunt May to help her at feast shelters. As Spider-Man, he has already gone toe-to-toe with primary villains like Electro, Vulture, and Kingpin, and his newest nemesis has a powerful connection to his personal life as Peter Parker, as Paquette wanted to include Peter just as much as Spider-Man in order to tell a man-behind-the-mask story. Right away, Insomniac bypassed the Spider-Man origin story that's so well known, skipped the tragic loss of Uncle Ben that's beginning to lose its meaning through desensitization, and gave us a Peter Parker/Spider-Man who has seen and dealt with quite a lot already. From their own knowledge of the character, as well as making use of the Marvel Games office's access to the Marvel Archives, which contain every Marvel comic ever written, the team boiled the character's narrative thread down to a single statement. Whenever Peter wins, Spider-Man loses. Whenever Spider-Man wins, Peter loses. With this emotional core, Intihar and Paquette, along with the rest of the creative team, came up with a story that feels new yet familiar, with the kind of emotional stakes that would be right at home in any Spider-Man comic. Even when faced with impossible decisions, imploding relationships, and soul-crushing loss, both Spider-Man and Peter Parker stand tall as beacons of hope and positivity in Insomniac's original Spider-Man story. Choosing a rogues gallery.
Oops, guess we're stuck in here for a while. Want to play 20 questions? No? How about we thumb wrestle? Okay, face punch it is.
Villains for Spidey's new adventure were chosen early. Creative director Brian Intihar had no shortage of villains he wanted to use, and ideas on how to incorporate them. The team considered many villains, old and new, and chose what best fit the story and gameplay, focusing on villains that had an impact on both Peter Parker and Spider-Man's life, while also using some fan favorites. Tying villains to both Spider-Man and Peter explains the decision to include more modern Spider-Man villains, like Mr. Negative, who runs the homeless shelter where Aunt May works. But it's not the only reason for Mr. Negative's inclusion. The team liked that Mr. Negative and his alter ego, Martin Lee, were unique, letting players know that this was a new Spider-Man. Additionally, the negative energy weapons that the Inner Demons use was appealing from a gameplay standpoint, forcing the player to change up their fighting strategy to avoid their energy. Vulture was included because of his flying ability, since it could present a unique challenge for Spider-Man from the perspective of gameplay. Overall, each of the enemies used in the game presented a unique ability that worked as a challenge for Spider-Man to overcome. To design villains for the game, the team looked over the history of the characters and made choices to bring them into the modern era while respecting their history. In Electro's case, electricity would light up his face in the shape of a star, much like the classic design. Vulture received a new flight mask that mirrored the look of a vulture's beak. Once villains were decided upon, Brian sent all of the choices with his ideas to lead writer John Paquette, who weaved the tale under this direction. New Spider-Man, new Spider look. As the art director, Jacinda Chu utilized the paralyzing amount of Spider-Man history to draw inspiration from and find out what exactly makes a Spider-Man suit. That might seem like a pretty simple problem to solve at first, but Jacinda had to comb through decades worth of Spider-Man to analyze their designs, while also developing a look that would make their own version unique and stand out. It's pretty clear now that she nailed her task. Hard. Insomniac's Spider-Man accomplishes the same thing visually as it does narratively, new yet familiar. Despite Spider-Man coming in all colors, shapes, and sizes, as can be attested by what we've seen of Across the Spider-Verse, Jacinda determined that the best way to go would be to maintain the red and blue color scheme that people are familiar with the same web patterning that fans recognize, originating at the center of the face and expanding outward in all directions. But the new part? Now that's where Jacinda's work truly shines. For this new, older version of Peter Parker, the thought process behind creating a new suit was, what would a 23-year-old use and be interested in when making a functional suit? What she came up with was an athletics wear-inspired suit that is designed to provide plenty of flexibility, while also offering some protection and even offensive capabilities. The blue material is intended to be the traditional spandex or lycra that's often associated with superhero suits, and also used in real life for things like yoga pants, with specific paneling in areas that would require reinforcement, such as the knees, inner thighs, inner elbows, and shoulders. Accompanying the blue material is the signature Spider-Man red material, which is still flexible, but much thicker than the blue parts. This red material covers important areas that benefit from light armor or impact resistance, including the head, chest, waist, outer thighs, and hands. Jacinda says that these are areas that could potentially scrape on walls and such while web swinging, so Peter would want those to have extra protection. Then, for the stroke of genius that makes Insomniac's Spider-Man look iconic and battle-ready, the white accents. These look great for sure, but they are also an intentional part of the design. The white material on the Insomniac suit is actually a flexible carbon fiber, a super tough material used in things like boats, planes, and spaceships for areas that need to be light but also strong. The white carbon fiber spider on the chest and back is there to absorb more damage, while the white material on the hands and feet can be used for both damage absorption and dealing out damage of his own. Speaking of his spider feet, you might have noticed that this Spider-Man doesn't have the signature red boots that have extended up past the calf on many past iterations of the character. Would a 23-year-old really want to integrate a boot into their costume when the rest of it's inspired by athletics and compression wear? Probably not, and that's how the new sneaker look was born. With that, the suit was down. But what would his body look like underneath? The overall build of this Spider-Man went through a few iterations, including a gangly teenager similar to what we've seen in Ultimate Spider-Man, and a big buff linebacker-style build. The skinny spider and the buff bug just didn't look right in gameplay testing, so what was settled on in the end was something in between. A svelte, strong character with clearly defined muscles, but not overly big. Kind of like an acrobat or a gymnast, which makes sense considering the character's skill set. To make sure their Spider-Man looked as strong, skilled, and confident in motion as he did standing still, the animation team actually used a mixture of motion capture and handmade animations. Common things like running, walking, or throwing a punch made sense to use a stuntman's motion capture. But for things that are less common and motion capturable, say crawling up a wall or swinging through the air and doing tricks, special animations were made. Additionally, in order to prevent an event known as clipping, when parts or materials on a character in a video game seem to go through each other, the animation team painstakingly created the animation model for Spider-Man, or rig. This ensured that every muscle, fabric, and limb would deform and act as they would in real life instead of clipping through each other. An incredibly important feature, considering the range of motion the character has. Becoming the Spider-Man. When it came time to decide who would bring Spider-Man to life, Insomniac was on the hunt for someone who would be able to accurately capture the dimensionality they were trying to accomplish. Someone who could deliver the wisecracks, but also be believable for the dramatic moments. In the end, they brought on somebody that they had just recently collaborated with, someone who has decades of experience in voice acting, Yuri Lowenthal. The legendary voice actor's name will be familiar to anyone who's enjoyed a video game, anime, or cartoon in the past 20 years, as Lowenthal has voiced characters in everything. From Gundam, to Gurren Lagann, to Ben 10, to VeggieTales, to Bayonetta, to Persona 4, and hundreds of other credits. You get it, he's been in a ton of different things. Among those other credits are 2 Insomniac projects, Resistance 3 and Sunset Overdrive. When Yuri was brought in to do a test recording for Spider-Man, his participation in the just-released Sunset Overdrive almost worked against him. Some people involved with the project thought that since Yuri had just done that game, he could only be associated with that for now, and he wouldn't be able to be Spider-Man as well. Yuri himself didn't even believe that he would be chosen at first, especially since he was almost double their Spider-Man's age. But from that first test, it was clear that Yuri was the right fit, and work began immediately. He was able to create a new Spider-Man persona while capturing the essence of the Spider-Man voices that have come before in the TV shows, movies, and games, thanks to his lifelong love of the character. The voice acting process is another place where Insomniac's dedication and attention to detail shows. You've probably played other Spider-Man games, right? Did you ever notice how he always sounds the same, whether he's standing still or exerting energy?
No! No!
That's not something most people think about. But the maniacs at Insomniac did. That's why, in addition to all of the dramatic, comedic, and heartfelt lines they had Yuri record, they also recorded 2 different reads for various conversations, based on whether Spider-Man was at rest or doing something strenuous. It might not even be something you notice in-game, thanks to how seamlessly the dynamic line tracks change. While Spider-Man's mask is iconic, Peter Parker's face is a bit more up to interpretation. Actor John Bubniak provided the face of a battle-worn 23-year-old Peter Parker for the PlayStation 4 original and was received well by fans. But when it came time to remaster the game for PS5 and PC, Insomniac decided to go with a new actor to portray Spider-Man's face, Ben Jordan. Jordan's facial model appeared younger than John Bubniak's. When this change was first discovered, it caused some controversy online, as many people preferred the original look from PS4. Many fans accused Insomniac and Sony of trying to make the character look like Tom Holland, the actor from the Spider-Man Home trilogy, while also criticizing them for making the character look younger. Insomniac responded to this criticism by suggesting that Ben's face better matched Yuri Lowenthal's vocal and motion capture, creating more natural-looking face movement. Ultimately, which version is better is up to each person. But both face models offer us a believable Peter Parker that you could imagine running into on Manhattan streets. Creating gameplay that swings. From the project onset, Insomniac knew they had to get gameplay right. They knew they wanted gameplay that was easy to pick up and play, had fluid traversal in combat, and made you feel like Spider-Man. According to director of gameplay Doug Sheehan, the team started with a simple vision statement: play like a superhero movie feels. To help realize their vision, they looked at past Spider-Man titles to see what had worked and what did not. But perhaps more importantly, they studied what is still a shining example of a superhero video game, the Batman Arkham series. In fact, Doug and others involved with gameplay development would go so far as to say that the Arkham games directly inspired their Spider-Man game. The comparisons are hard to miss. Spider-Man swings around the city, much in the same way Batman grapples and glides around the Arkham games. The rhythmic combat with attacks, counters, and blocks is also similar in structure and feel to the Arkham games. But with Marvel's Spider-Man, Insomniac's goal wasn't to reinvent the wheel, but to perfect it. During development, the first thing the team implemented was getting Spider-Man swinging around an open-world city. The size of the world is important for making web swinging feel amazing, and the team developed many test maps to understand what building and street proportions would work. Speaking about the game pre-release, Ted Price said that Marvel's Spider-Man was the biggest, most complex game they had ever created up to that point. However, that didn't mean the process of creating the perfect web-swinging sandbox was in any way a struggle for the studio. If you recall, I mentioned that Insomniac took on the Spider-Man project in 2014, almost right after they had shipped Sunset Overdrive. A game set in a big open world with flashy traversal and dynamic animations. You can probably see where this is going. Given the similarities between their previous project and what they would now be working on, Insomniac was able to save some time and effort by using the work they had already done on Sunset Overdrive as a starting point for what they wanted to accomplish with Spider-Man, which was to make the open world several times larger and give the player the most accurate depiction of how Spider-Man gets around New York. And, in the eyes of most gamers, they succeeded. Spider-Man doesn't just web swing. He zips, flips, parkours, and even interacts with special parts of the environment in fun ways, such as sliding through concrete tubes at construction sites, slingshotting himself through the wreckage of a falling sign, or dashing through a fire escape as he wall runs. The imagination and the lengths Insomniac went to in order to create specific animations for these interactions are truly staggering. In interviews, Insomniac developers stressed the iteration that went into every aspect of Spider-Man's development. They even codified their efforts in every aspect of the game with the mantra, "Be greater." Control of Spider-Man's swing was no exception, requiring a great deal of iteration to get to the final result. Some of the improvements to the swing made over its multiple iterations include: gravity increases the higher you are in your swing, which helps to give the player's swings more weight without sacrificing control. The game gently steers players clear of buildings as they're swinging, with dampening on analog input near buildings. Spider-Man's momentum remains camera forward when swinging from point to point. This alleviated a complaint testers had about an inability to swing in a straight line. Web lines shorten to avoid buildings below Spider-Man while swinging. Swinging near the top of buildings causes their swing pivot points to invisibly move up to make the swinging feel more consistent. One particular sticking point for the team was how to get Spider-Man's webs to hit buildings considerately and naturally. The first method they tried was using raycasts, which essentially entailed shooting lines out into 3D space to find the nearest building points to attach to. Relying on this method alone led to some clunky web attachment points on buildings. The team iterated on this idea by manually marking areas for web attachment on each building with a simplified mesh to supplement the raycast method. After shooting a web, the raycast would first bring back several buildings which were in range for the player to attach. The web attachment position would then be positioned on the building somewhere between the player and where they're heading. The team scaled this to the entire city by using a mix of Houdini city generation technology and in-engine prefabs to generate and store all this new manual web attachment point geometry. When designing the game, Insomniac wanted the camera to be very cinematic. To accomplish this, each of Spider-Man's traversal techniques has its own camera scripting. When Spider-Man dips and shoots down, the camera pulls back. If Spider-Man zips away, the camera lags behind to convey speed. I guess the thinking at Insomniac was for the game to feel like a superhero movie. The camera needed to look the part. Arkham was an obvious source of inspiration for Spider-Man's combat, but that inspiration was only a starting position, as the team didn't want the game to feel like a brawler. Insomniac's Brian Weiser worked on Spider-Man's combat during the game's early development. He mentioned that he wanted to give Spider-Man many ways to take down enemies, focusing on moves that would amount to more than just punches and kicks. This would help differentiate their combat from other open-world third-person games, and was a good fit for their version of Spider-Man. Part of Spider-Man's character is an amazing inventor. He made his own web shooters after all, and he has built a number of other awesome gadgets throughout his history. This was something Insomniac took note of and had a great interest in, especially with their own background in making crazy gadgets for the Ratchet & Clank games. To address this side of the character and satisfy their own need to make gadgets, Insomniac implemented the customizable suit powers that offer plenty of new ways to handle combat. The suit power UI even looks similar to how Ratchet & Clank's weapon and gadgetry UI appears in their games. The powers and learned attacks gave players further agency in how they tackle the game's many enemies. The team designed a lot of verticality into Spider-Man's combat too, and incorporated many ways to get enemies and Spidey airborne. Insomniac knew Spider-Man's moveset would require interesting AI to take on to make Spider-Man's moveset feel worthwhile. To that end, 64 AI classes with unique attacks and behaviors were created and used across the game's 5 enemy factions. A smaller gameplay team was used to accomplish this, compared to their previous game, Sunset Overdrive, which only had 19 AI classes. Creating the playground. The second most important character in any Spider-Man story is... no, not Aunt May. New York City itself. And Insomniac had an eye to make their Manhattan massive. But just making a bigger world wouldn't work, and Insomniac knew that. Their New York City would also need to feel like it was full of life, constantly active, and have references to a larger Marvel universe in it. Wherever you go in the game, regardless of what time it is in the day-night cycle, there are always cars driving, people walking around, and random encounters to intervene in. This seems like it should be standard for any Spider-Man game after Treyarch's Spider-Man 2, but Marvel's Spider-Man accomplishes it in a way that feels more real and grounded than previous Spider-Man games. The team even went so far as to hire graffiti artists to add extra authenticity to the streets of New York. As far as existing in the Marvel universe, it's kind of hard to miss some very iconic buildings as you swing through New York. There's Avengers Tower, the Sanctum Sanctorium, and even the law offices of Nelson and Murdoch, though that last one is much harder to find. It's not clear if Insomniac was planning very far into the future by including these locations in its massive map, but even if there are no wild crossover event games, their presence, along with voice lines wondering where the Avengers might be, really work to place Marvel's Spider-Man in that very specific universe. To actually create this world, Insomniac made use of a 3D procedural software system called Houdini, supported by a pipeline of other third-party tools and in-house solutions. Insomniac's principal technical artist, David Santiago, has conducted talks at GDC to cover exactly how he and his team were able to use Houdini to create their groundbreaking iterative pipeline containing everything from the ground, buildings, and traffic to the audio and lighting. The team split up the map of Manhattan into 128 by 128 kilometer tiles that could be generated procedurally. Altogether, Spider-Man's Manhattan is approximately 6 kilometers by 3 kilometers and contains 544 roads and 1,202 alleys, most of which are fake, as New York has far fewer alleys in the real world. To avoid repeat work, Insomniac worked in a 3-phase pipeline when designing the city. In Phase 1, roads and basic build geometry were generated and tweaked until finalized. Artists and designers came in Phase 2 and tweaked aspects of a tile, adding detail to building geometry and setting NPC, car, prop, and enemy density using the tools provided by the procedurally generated pipeline. At the end of this phase, the game was expected to be fully playable. Finally, in Phase 3, artists and designers would polish and add handcrafted detail to an area of the game. These phases were done for the city district by district, and the team focused on sticking to this pipeline, as having to change a street from Phase 1 could force the team to redo work for Phase 2 and 3. Since having adjustments to buildings and roads can affect the placement of enemies, props, and even other roads on adjacent tiles. The phase pipeline approach was set up to avoid these pitfalls while still making use of procedurally generated tools. Legacy of greatness. Insomniac reached the finish line when Marvel's Spider-Man hit shelves on September 7th, 2018. All told, the process of getting Insomniac signed on, building a new Spider-Man, crafting a new story, developing the game itself, and iterating on their work took roughly 4 years. That's 4 times the amount of development time the previous 3 to 4 Spider-Man games had, and that much time being given to a stellar studio like Insomniac gets results like Marvel's Spider-Man. From the very beginning, Insomniac had one goal in mind: to make something great. In fact, their in-house mantra that became core to everything they did, "Be Greater," was even used as the game's official tagline. The words that pushed every person on the team forward and inspired them to make the best game they possibly could are on every copy of Marvel's Spider-Man. Now, it's been almost 5 years since that game's release. In that time, Insomniac was bought by Sony for $229 million and finally brought in-house as a first-party developer, and Marvel's Spider-Man has sold over 30 million copies in total. This includes the original PS4 release, the remastered version on PS5, and the spin-off game, Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. It's been a whirlwind for sure, and we also know that Insomniac has been hard at work on Marvel's Spider-Man 2 for some of that time. As of now, there isn't much information to go on besides the announcement trailer from 2021, but there's no doubt that Insomniac is doing everything they can to expand on the world they established, create an excellent experience that fans will love, and deliver something people aren't expecting. When Insomniac Games released Marvel's Spider-Man back in 2018, they changed superhero games forever. But for all of the awesome action and powerful story elements that game had, not everything they created made it to the final product. So, if you've ever wondered about what didn't make it into the final version of the game, find out in Marvel's Spider-Man Cut Content. Game Facts Special: Sliding System. It's no secret that Insomniac nailed the web swinging in Marvel's Spider-Man. It's fast, fluid, and realistic enough to actually make you feel like Spider-Man, while still being mechanically simple enough for just about anybody to enjoy. Part of that system are the flashy animations that play when Spidey encounters obstacles, such as signs sticking out of the sides of buildings, or things like AC units on rooftops. The athletic hero handles all of these without breaking a sweat or missing a beat. Hey, they don't call him Peter Parkour for nothing. Ba-da-ps. An unused portion of that system was found deep in the code of Spider-Man Remastered's PC release: a sliding system. As demonstrated by YouTuber Tiffsomniac, it's actually possible to partially restore the mechanic into the game, though it's not nearly as smooth or fluid as the finished parkour system. Spidey kinda just slides on the floor, even over bumps and short obstacles. According to a code snippet, the sliding system would have kicked in when the game detected an appropriate obstacle in front of you, something with enough space to slide under. Similar to that system, there's also an incomplete animation and code references to a wall sliding system that would have seen Spidey sliding down the sides of buildings. Seeing how it's so much easier and faster to just dive off of buildings, it's not likely that this system would have seen much use anyways. Cut villains. Marvel's Spider-Man was already jam-packed with villains from throughout the hero's history, including a few silly cameos. But there is actually a handful of villains that were planned, and some that were even partially created, but never completed or implemented. The Hood. Created by Brian K. Vaughan and Kyle Holtz, the Hood, aka Parker Robbins, is a petty criminal turned mystical criminal mastermind. He even took a shot at Doctor Strange at one point in an attempt to become the Sorcerer Supreme. In a screenshot that was uncovered from early in the game's development, you can see a figure that looks an awful lot like the Hood on a rooftop across from Spider-Man, who's hanging on to the side of the building on the left side of the image. The Feast Center can be seen in the background, so this is definitely a location that exists in the final product. The scene this image was taken from, and the Hood himself, obviously never made it to the finished game, but his appearance here is still notable. Especially since one of his most prominent roles in association with Spider-Man was in Dark Reign, a storyline that also included the primary villain of Marvel's Spider-Man, Mr. Negative. Crime Master. Also in the files of Spider-Man Remastered exists a complete 3D model of a villain known as Crime Master. Created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko for The Amazing Spider-Man number 26, Crime Master is a professional gangster with ties to Green Goblin. As you can see in this clip, the Crime Master model is pretty well detailed, so the developers must have been seriously considering his inclusion at some point. But given Insomniac's dedication to remaining faithful to Spider-Man lore while also making it their own, maybe they're waiting to introduce Green Goblin before breaking Crime Master out of dev jail. Big Man. The final cut villain hidden in the game's code is Big Man, better known as Frederick Foswell. Also created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, Big Man was the head crime lord in New York and the leader of the Enforcers for a time. Far from a big man in his daily life, Foswell wore a mask, an oversized coat, and platform boots to make himself more imposing when he had to appear as his criminal alter ego. Curiously, there is no model of Big Man anywhere in the files of the game. There are only references to him, and those utilize the model for Crime Master. This is interesting, because Big Man actually plays a role in The Amazing Spider-Man number 26, the very same issue that introduced Crime Master. Could Big Man show up in a future game alongside Crime Master? We'll just have to wait and see. The Web Line. The influence that the Batman Arkham games had on Insomniac's version of Spider-Man is pretty obvious, and one particular gadget that was cut would have made that inspiration even clearer. YouTuber Uncle has this video that demonstrates a mod created by a talented group of glitch hunters, which showcases the deleted webline gadget. Like the Arkham series line launcher, the web line fires a stable line of web between 2 points that can then be used for support or traversal. Instead of comparing it to the line launcher, you could think of the web line as a way of recreating the scene in The Amazing Spider-Man where Peter uses hundreds of lines of web to track down Lizard in the sewer. The short video shows other ways to use the gadget, including connecting 2 enemies during combat. It even works in boss fights and persists through QTEs. Unused suits. With 40 unique suits available in Marvel Spider-Man by the time Insomniac moved on to their next game, you'd think that everything made it off the cutting room floor before the end. However, a quick glance at the portfolio of art director and visual designer Hawam Mora will tell you that that's not exactly the case, and what was possibly left out is very interesting. It's clear that the game's UI design changed quite a bit from what Hawam shows, but the suit selection screen has a few choice visual tidbits. Up top, you have the game's standard advanced suit, nothing strange there. However, just below that, we can see an image of what looks like a black version of the advanced suit. Could this have been an early version of the symbiote suit we'll see in Spider-Man 2? Or was this just perhaps some more stealthy advanced suit? We might never know, especially since the symbiote suit in Spider-Man 2 looks far more organic in nature. Moving on from that mystery, we can also see an image of Miles' spider suit as an option. It would have been weird to have a Miles suit as an option for Peter, especially since Miles is in the game already before he gets his powers, so it's a good thing they saved this one. It's also worth noting that the suit here looks quite different from the suit that showed up in Spider-Man Miles Morales, so this suit might never see the light of day. Spider Cop. The final unused suit would have been the payoff to a running joke throughout Marvel's Spider-Man.
Chief never did understand Spider Cop. Thought he was a loose cannon.
Already regretting this.
That's right, the gag between Spidey and Officer Yuri was intended to culminate in this suit, which sees Peter donning a police jacket, belt, hat, and cap. Oh, and you can't forget those killer shades. Topping off the design is a white mustache that has somehow managed to fight its way through Spider-Man's mask. It looks an awful lot like Stan Lee's mustache, but we can't confirm that's what it's supposed to be. It's not clear why this suit never made it into the game, but it could have had something to do with seeing a cop beat the living snot out of people. Cut co-op mode. When Spider-Man Remastered's PC port was released, there was nothing stopping fans from data mining every little piece of information they could. Part of that rampant data mining was the shocking reveal of a possible multiplayer mode that was cut from the final game. Twitter user DNIWeTamp tweeted some very interesting findings in 2022. There are references in the code to multiplayer models, such as MP Spider-Man Miles Morales .model, and statements like, if set and in co-op, Character 2 will see this text. It seems like the cut co-op mode would have played with some recognizable phrases for Spider-Man fans, with the winner of one of those matches getting a message that says either Miles or Peter is, quote, the superior Spider-Man. Miles didn't get his powers till the end of the game, so this mode would have seemed a little out of place. Could we be getting this in Spider-Man 2, and Insomniac has somehow managed to hide it from us all the way up to release? Maybe not. But there's no harm in hoping. Insomniac's upcoming Spider-Man 2 has 2 awesome playable characters, but it's not the first Spider-Man game to pull that off. Learn about the game that did it first, and the fan-favorite character it made playable in Ultimate Spider-Man Game Facts Special. According to Jonathan Zamkoff, the senior producer at Treyarch, Activision approached Treyarch about making an Ultimate Spider-Man game in April 2003. By that point, the series had been running for 3 years and proved to be wildly popular thanks to its modern, unique take on the character. Treyarch was no stranger to working with Activision or developing Spider-Man games, as they had already collaborated on the Dreamcast version of the Spider-Man game from 2000, and the tie-in games for the 2 Sam Raimi films, the second of which was still in development at the time. Putting together the Ultimate Team. Development began in earnest in June 2003. According to Brian Pass, a producer at Activision, the first step in developing an Ultimate Spider-Man video game was putting together a team that could get the job done. That meant putting some of their best internal employees on the project, as well as rounding up as much of the talent involved with the comic series as they could get their hands on. In addition to lead designer Brian Reed and creative director Chris Busey, the first person outside of Treyarch to join the development of Ultimate Spider-Man was the renowned Marvel Comics writer Brian Michael Bendis. He is responsible for many of the company's best stories over the past 20+ years. Then, the sole illustrator for the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, Mark Bagley, joined their ranks. He's the man responsible for the series' iconic look, and Activision put him to work immediately to create character concepts for the many characters that were set to appear in the game. Bagley created so many unique versions of Marvel heroes and villains, about 30, that Jonathan Zamkoff said they weren't even able to use all of them. That's a shame, because the ones that are there are awesome. Valiant visuals. Mark Bagley's art speaks for itself, but the people he works with have nothing but praise for him. Brian Michael Bendis has said, Mark Bagley is a wildly underestimated artist, and while speaking about the project, Amiz Kirshen, the VP of Marvel Interactive and executive producer of the Ultimate Spider-Man game, said, "The nice thing about Bagley's look is it's kind of a more clean, stylized look. That's what makes it a really easy transition for the guys at Treyarch to make his look work in 3D. That easy transition was crucial for the game's development, because the first thing Treyarch wanted to nail down was a visual presentation that remained faithful to the comic books that so many people loved. Bringing the comic book to life. However, while transitioning Bagley's style over to the 3D realm was easy, actually making everything look and work properly in motion was a completely separate ordeal. Not wanting to let the Spider-Man license or its fans down, the Ultimate Spider-Man team spent the first 3 to 4 months of the project creating an entirely new shader system that they call 3D comic book inking to bring Bagley's dramatic style to life while adding the depth required of a full-on console game release. Treyarch's proprietary shader technology worked by combining texture maps with high polygon character models to create the comic book look. Thick outlines, well-defined musculature, and very specific coloring and shadows are all made possible in this game by 3D comic book inking. The Spider-Man model and most of the character models in the game were in the 7,000 polygon range, and Venom's model was around 9,000 polygons. For comparison, Kratos in God of War 2018 is 32,000 polygons just for his face, and the final boss of Marvel's Spider-Man on PS4 is said to contain around 1 million polygons. Yes, we have come a long way in terms of graphics. Doubling down on immersion. Treyarch didn't just stop once their complicated graphics system was in place. To further cement that this game is an Ultimate Spider-Man game, completely separate from anything that had come before, they also included another visual element, comic panels. Rather than relying on run-of-the-mill cutscenes, Ultimate Spider-Man's narrative is told through a fascinating mixture of traditional cutscenes and motion graphic comic panels. Characters leap and fall through these panels. Dramatic moments are created through the use of separation and negative space between them, and panels will even occasionally pop up during gameplay to highlight action or to give more context about a situation. One example sees Spider-Man swinging through the city only to come across a person trapped under a burning car. While the player continues to control Spider-Man, the screen splits into 2 panels, with the second showing the person trapped under the car and in dire need of help. It's an incredibly effective visual complement to Ultimate Spider-Man's already groundbreaking look, and it went a long way to make players feel like they were immersed in the comics. With great ambition. That immersion was clearly one of Treyarch's goals when they were charting out what this game would be, but there was also another, much more adventurous goal they had in mind. To make Ultimate Spider-Man the biggest, most ambitious Spider-Man game ever created. According to Jonathan Zamkoff, more than 100 people had their hands on the project, and while a large majority of those contributors helped to create the amazing visuals we already talked about, some of them had the burden of making an original Spider-Man story that stacked up and felt just as faithful to the series as the visuals were. Writing stories isn't easy, and it's even worse when you're writing a story for a character that has been around for more than 40 years. Thankfully, when you're writing about a superhero, you have a baked-in plot device to test the hero, push them to their limits, and contrast their morals and attributes with villains. A venomous villain. Activision conducted extensive research into the most popular villains Spider-Man has ever faced. Spider-Man fans will know without saying that the result of that search would come down to a single villain, Venom. But the overwhelming popularity of that character even came as a surprise to those behind the original comic book run. When questioned about Venom, Brian Michael Bendis said, "When we introduced Ultimate Venom into the comic book, our sales spiked. They almost doubled. I had no idea that Venom was so popular." Needless to say, Venom was selected as the primary antagonist of the game, and the narrative would heavily include the character. In fact, the storyline that was created for the Ultimate Spider-Man video game is actually a direct continuation of the Ultimate Venom arc in the comics, the one in which the villain's introduced. This was the same arc that essentially doubled the sales of the series, and there were still some mysteries to be solved when the final issue in that arc was published. We have all these questions that have never been answered that we get to tell everybody for the first time. Having a video game include story and plot points that are crucial to an ongoing comic was a bit of a gamble, but the writing team was excited and more than prepared for the task. Plus, making Venom central to the storyline gave the development team the opportunity to do something that hadn't been done outside of Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage and the Marvel vs. Capcom games: make Venom a playable character. Don't forget, this was 2003, so long before the Marvel Ultimate Alliance games made Venom playable. At that time, the only real way to play as Venom in 3D was in Ultimate Spider-Man: controlling the chaos. Once Venom was confirmed to be playable, that decision was followed by another that made the gameplay split evenly between playing as Spider-Man and Venom. The purpose of this decision was to create a more fulfilling story that felt authentic to both characters and allowed for a deeper exploration of the connection they share. Chris Busey said, "There were key points where, if you only knew it from the Spidey side, you would never fully get what was going on. It was essential that we had you play from the Venom side." Of course, including Venom in this capacity makes for a great story with awesome storytelling, sure, but Treyarch knew what everybody, including the developers themselves, wanted out of a playable Venom: ultimate chaos and destruction. After all, Venom is the polar opposite of Spider-Man's altruistic heroism, and the developers wanted to make sure that this was showcased through gameplay as well as the story. I love playing Spider-Man, and it's fun to swing around, but the idea of being this massively big, violent, very strong character that can really wreak havoc in the city is very exciting, said Dave Stoll, the president of Treyarch at the time. In Ultimate Spider-Man, both Spider-Man and Venom move differently, act differently, they have unique combat systems, and completely different abilities. As always, Spider-Man is quick, zippy, and hyper-athletic, which facilitates his lightning-fast punches, bouncing around the screen, and aerobic web swinging. On the other hand, Venom feels heavy and is more at home throwing cars and eating civilians than he is moving with any kind of speed. These differences make for a one-of-a-kind experience, but the depth of the work involved with creating and making sure each character played well was akin to creating two separate games. A marvelous roster. Treyarch already had their work cut out for them between the visuals, story, and gameplay, but they couldn't even stop there. This had to be the biggest, best Spider-Man game ever, and Brian Reed made sure that meant the players would see more villains in this than in any previous Spider-Man game. "We were going to grab everything we could at Marvel and throw it into this game," he said. In addition to often-seen enemies like Electro, Shocker, and Rhino, Ultimate Spider-Man also includes lesser-known villains like Beetle, Boomerang, Silver Sable, and the Wild Pack. They didn't draw the line at villains either. There are plenty of Marvel heroes and other characters in Ultimate Spider-Man as well, including Nick Fury, Wolverine, Johnny Storm, Sharon Carter, and even Arachno Man is there as an unlockable costume. Even better, all of these characters are completely new Ultimate versions with new designs by Mark Bagley that fit within the Ultimate Spider-Man universe. The intent was to have a cameo of a character you think you know, but to have it feel like you're seeing them for the first time again. Bringing the Spider home. The final piece of the puzzle when it came to making the biggest Spider-Man game of all time was pretty unique at the time, an open-world playground. The developers wanted to create not just any New York, but Ultimate Spider-Man's New York. That meant including major landmarks from the comic series, like Queensboro Bridge, where the Green Goblin almost succeeded in killing Mary Jane. To get a proper feel for the spaces they were creating, members of the development team were sent from Treyarch's Santa Monica, California studio all the way to the East Coast to visit New York City. Their purpose on the cross-country trip was to take pictures of just about anything they found interesting, from the streets and alleyways of Chinatown and Little Italy all the way down to nondescript signs and manhole covers. In addition to the now standard open-world Manhattan, Ultimate Spider-Man also expanded its open world to include Queens, where Peter lives and goes to school. Since Ultimate Spider-Man features a much younger, 15-year-old Peter Parker, this decision made sense to the developers. Why wouldn't a kid be able to go back to his house or hang out around his school? Reaching the finish line. Development on Ultimate Spider-Man went on for a little over 2 years, and the game was eventually released on September 22, 2005. The team at Treyarch was satisfied with the work they'd done and were excited for the game to hit shelves. Mostly, I'm really excited about the story we get to tell and the events we get to do, and the fact that we actually fit into the comic book continually, said lead designer Brian Reed. For this little brief moment in time, I actually get to touch Peter Parker's life and do something to it. That's really the coolest part of this project for me. It's true. For a time, the events of the Ultimate Spider-Man game were actually canon, and future issues factored them into the plot points that came later. The War of the Symbiotes story arc that came along in 2008 adapted the game's events, but you can never take away the fun of terrorizing New York City as Venom. Ever wonder what Spider-Man games never made it out of production for gamers to enjoy? Find out in every canceled Spider-Man game, Game Facts Special. There are canceled Spider-Man games for multiple Xbox consoles, Wii, PS2, PC, and more. We'll be taking a look at all of them in this episode. First up, while Sam Raimi was working on the embattled sequel film to Spider-Man 3, a video game adaptation of what was planned to be Spider-Man 4 was also in production at Radical Entertainment. This video game would have been structured much like the previous 2 Spider-Man film adaptations, featuring an open-world map of New York City with various side missions and collectibles. When the Spider-Man 4 film was shut down, work on the video game accompaniment was also cancelled. Thankfully, some of the work Radical did on Spider-Man 4 was recycled for Prototype 2 and didn't go to waste. Screenshots of the cancelled project have been circulating since 2019, and gameplay video also surfaced at the end of November 2019. An incomplete version of both the Wii and Xbox 360 versions of the game has been leaked by different sources. In 1996, Byron Preiss Multimedia and Brooklyn Multimedia released Spider-Man: The Sinister Six on PC. This Spider-Man adventure was structured like a Telltale game, in that it was a choose-your-own-adventure title with branching paths based on decisions and actions made throughout the game. A year later, in 1997, a sequel to that game was in the works, titled Spider-Man: The Venom Factor. Despite being included on developer Sapphire's website on its list of completed games, Spider-Man: The Venom Factor was never released. On the archived version of that very same website, you can find an image and a short cinematic from the unreleased game, which you can see now. Spider-Man: Web of Shadows was a 2008 action-adventure game developed by Shaba Games and published by Activision, who held the publishing rights to the webhead for many years. Web of Shadows received only middling reviews from both critics and gamers, but it did have a few universally praised features. Among them was its implementation of aerial and wall-crawling combat. Shaba Games got to work on a sequel to Web of Shadows shortly after release, planning to expand on those few mechanics, as well as introduce Wolverine as a playable character after his appearance in the previous game. Shaba Games unfortunately shut down in the middle of 2009, while the sequel, tentatively called Spider-Man Classic, was in pre-production. The only information available for Spider-Man Classic, outside of some concept renders and the fact that Wolverine was planned to be playable, was the game's format. Instead of an open-world game, Spider-Man Classic would have instead been a level-based game, in which each level was designed to lead up to an iconic villain, which would effectively put a more significant emphasis on the combat mechanics Web of Shadows was praised for. There are even more cancelled Spider-Man games next, but Spider-Man isn't alone in all these games. Everyone from Spider-Ham to Doctor Doom appear in the games ahead. First, make sure you're subscribed to the channel because we plan to keep growing and providing you with all kinds of game fact videos. Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions and Edge of Time were going to receive the remastered treatment. This is according to an anonymous Reddit user who claims to work at Activision. Apparently, sometime after Activision lost the Spider-Man game rights in 2014, they attempted to work out a deal with Disney to regain the rights. Had this deal gone through, we could have seen remasters of Shattered Dimension, Edge of Time, Ultimate Spider-Man, and more. Instead, every indication is that Marvel traded Sony the Spider-Man game rights in exchange for Spider-Man staying in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But we have no official confirmation of this. The video game tie-in to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 3 landed in 2007 for a smattering of consoles, including PC, GBA, Xbox 360, PS2, PS3, PSP, Wii, and DS. If the development of the game had gone according to the original plan, there would have been 2 other consoles appearing on that list. Both original Xbox and Nintendo GameCube versions of Spider-Man 3 were planned, but each one was scrapped for different reasons. The GameCube version was shut down due to the limited availability of resources on Activision's behalf, as they were also developing Shrek the Third for the console. The original Xbox port was cancelled because of the system's low sales numbers around that time. This next game is unlike other games on this list because it enjoyed a brief period of success before being shut down. The mobile gaming-focused developer Gameloft announced an endless runner titled Spider-Man Unlimited in June 2014. It was released a few months later in September 2014 and featured all manners of characters from throughout the Spider-Man universe, including Spider-Ham and Spider-Man 2099. New characters were also added in updates periodically. Also included in the more than 30 updates it received were new story chapters to extend players' enjoyment of the game, new enemies and stages, and event quests. Spider-Man Unlimited even had tie-in content for Avengers Infinity War developed for it. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to keep the game going, because by the end of March 2019, Gameloft had shut the game down due to declining engagement. But with over 30 million downloads, it was far from a failure. Marvel vs. Capcom kind of ruined the concept of Marvel fighting games. It's going to be incredibly difficult to make a game that tops that series, as was evidenced by Marvel Nemesis: Rise of the Imperfects. There was another attempt made at a Marvel fighter, but it just didn't get a chance to get off the ground. In 2007, EA Chicago was working on a game called Marvel Chaos, which was to be a third-person brawler starring a roster of iconic Marvel characters. Only 9 months into development, EA shut the project down after reports that the game was suffering from severe quality issues. EA's Chicago studio was also shut down shortly after, most likely due to the failure of Marvel Chaos. Unseen64 has plenty of screenshots of the unfinished game, which definitely seem rough. They do, however, show some gameplay of a classic comic-suited Spider-Man posed on top of a car and in mid-assault of Doctor Doom. There is also some rough footage of a gameplay prototype that gives a better idea of how the game would play. In 2000, Activision released a wildly popular and successful Spider-Man game on the original PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and the Sega Dreamcast a year later. It was actually one of the first games developed by Neversoft, who had just released the first Tony Hawk's Pro Skater game the prior year. When the time came for a sequel to capitalize on the success of the first game, the approach to development was a little less focused. Spider-Man had 3 separate sequels developed uniquely for 3 separate consoles. Spider-Man 2: Enter Electro was developed for PlayStation 1 and was the closest to the first game mechanically. So why didn't the N64 or Dreamcast get a sequel to a game that had appeared on those consoles? In the case of the N64, it's difficult to tell, as the system was fairly popular. But for the Dreamcast, its exclusion could likely be traced to a success of the console, or lack thereof. The system was discontinued in March 2001 after many months of stagnant sales. This development was probably early enough in the development of Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro that any work that had begun on a Dreamcast version could be scrapped. In 1992, Marvel started several lines of comics that made up the Marvel 2099 universe. These comics followed far future versions of favorite heroes, including the Punisher, Ghost Rider, and, yes, Spider-Man. Several years into these comics' run, Mindscape Inc. announced that they would be making a video game based on the 2099 universe, which would be based on the One Nation Under Doom storyline from the comics, and feature 2D side-scrolling gameplay with 3D character models. That announcement was made in February of 1996, with an intended release date of December 1st of the same year. By May, video demos on CD-ROM and VHS were being shipped to the gaming press for evaluation, and then a single playable level was shown in July. EGM featured a preview of the game in August that showed screenshots of the E3 gameplay, but it also included the reveal that Spider-Man 2099 would be appearing in the game as a playable character. However, as 1996 came to a close, Mindscape Inc. suffered financial issues that led to significant layoffs. This decrease in workforce caused the development of Marvel 2099 One Nation Under Doom to be abandoned, though it was never formally cancelled. Shortly after the release of the well-regarded Ultimate Spider-Man game in 2005, developer Treyarch began designing game assets and concept art for a potential sequel. They even managed to get Brian Michael Bendis, the writer of the first game and a prolific comic book writer, signed on to write the sequel's story. According to Chris Salazar, the lead texture artist for the game, Ultimate Spider-Man 2's story would have taken place in the winter and featured Green Goblin as the villain, and perhaps a playable character. Due to the winter setting, the map would have been covered in snow, and Chris even made snow-covered trees and tile sets for snowy streets. Unfortunately, development didn't progress much past that point. Activision didn't believe an Ultimate Spider-Man sequel would sell as well as the Spider-Man 2 film tie-in did, so they canceled the project before it had a chance to get off the ground. Thanks to Mike Alexander for writing this episode. Make sure to like the video and subscribe for a ton more canceled games. Check out our recent episodes on Mario and Zelda finds from Giga League. This is McGen signing off. Thanks for watching. This has been a GameFAQs special.